Kenya is considered a country with limited water resources. Nearly 17 million of its 41 million inhabitants do not have access to clean water. In fact, only 75% of urban and 50% of rural areas of the country are supplied in water. The needs of the capital, Nairobi, is estimated at 700,000 cubic meters per day, while the capacity of its water supply is 500,000 cubic meters, representing a gap of 200,000 to fill.
The economic and social developments anticipated by our Vision 2030, which is our Kenyan development blueprint, sets a target of universal access to water and basic sanitation for all by 2030. Further, under our Article 43(1) of our Constitution, access to clean and safe water in adequate quantities and reasonable standards of sanitation is a human right. My government, working with our devolved governments, which have the mandate for water and sanitation service provision, is fully committed to meet that target by 2030. Kenya will continue to promote the integrated water resource management approach to ensure adequate sources, to protect our catchments, and to safeguard biodiversity by promoting wider stakeholder participation, including involving local communities in water conservation activities.
Kenyan president was speaking at the 18th Congress of the African Water Association, which his country recently hosted. In fact, over 1,500 participants from at least 80 countries met in Nairobi around the issue of sustainable access to water and sanitation in Africa by 2030. Policymakers, public and private experts, African and foreign companies, development partners, researchers, and industry professionals are unanimous. Access to water is a matter of survival.
The need for and importance of sustainable access to water and sanitation for all who live in our continent cannot be overemphasized. One of the consequences of a lack of access is the startling statistic which we should all be conscious of. That is, every 12 seconds, one child dies of waterborne disease. Most of these innocent children are from our continent, and most of these kids are below the age of 5. Humankind, and in particular, all of us as water professionals and leaders, have a responsibility and obligation to rise to this challenge, facing our continent by seeking, finding, and creating innovative solutions in order to improve the lives of our people.
Le problème aujourd'hui, c'est qu'il y a dans beaucoup de cas
The issue currently is that there are several cases of contamination at the source, and if the source is not contaminated, then the water is being contaminated during transportation or during its storage at home. So our objective is to reduce and even eliminate during the transportation storage chain, because with the major drillings, which are a good thing, we observe that some are highly contaminated and people make long distances to transport and store that water. So we focus on low-cost technology that can be fixed in the compound, in the household.
This conference was an opportunity to make an inventory of the development of the water and sanitation sector and the environment in Africa. According to the African Water Association, over 300 million Africans have no access to water, yet the continent has huge potential, including 5.4 trillion cubic meters of renewable water operated at less than 5%.
C'est un problème d'infrastructure.
The issue is about infrastructure, but also due to the fact that this water is not evenly distributed across the continent. Some areas, such as Central Africa with the DRC and West Africa with Guinea, are replete with water, but the lack of infrastructure and the lack of financial resources to implement all this make it difficult for the populations to have water. But this water has to be made drinkable and taken to households, to the populations, and this is the major source of the challenge of access to water facing our populations. In urban areas, like I said earlier, this sudden increase of the population, which by 2050 is expected to give Africa the most important cities in the world in terms of population, puts a lot of pressure on water companies to meet the needs in terms of distribution, but also on the states, which have to build the proper infrastructure to meet the needs of the population.
How to find this funding? The question is recurrent, yet the continent does not necessarily lack financial resources. Development partners are a funding source depending on the players. It is, however, clear that they provide only a portion of the $5 billion needed annually to achieve the Sustainable Development Goal on water.
In Africa, we tend to always think we don't have money. I think to some extent that's not true. When you look at the budgets that many countries have for defense, they are very big. When it comes to water and sanitation, they come down to about 3% of the budget, of the national budget. So politically, there has to be a shift in focus and also increased focus on water and sanitation. So money is there. We also have the fact that we can still get funding from donors. That money is there. We need to focus it in the right direction.
On est souvent interpellé par les institutions de financement sur le fait qu'il n'y a pas assez de projets.
Funding institutions always point at the lack of projects for existing financial resources, and we have to look into this more closely. At the African Water Association, we develop capacity building programs for our water companies so they can be technically more efficient, but also so they can set up bankable projects.
Mettre en place des projets qui sont des projets bancables.
However, the continent recorded success stories. Countries like Senegal, Gabon, Uganda, and South Africa have improved in recent years the water supply in urban areas. These results were achieved through significant investments, both public and private, in the sector.
De 1996 à 2015 à peu près.
From 1996 to 2015, we invested more than 300 billion CFA francs. This money helped restore and resize all the drinkable water supply system of Dakar and increase access rate from 79% to about 99% for Dakar, and for the most part through access to connections and 95% in the regions. This is related to this level of investment and the availability of professionals in investment projects and network operations.
The sustainable access in Africa will be resolved by the people of Africa. We all need to get to a point where we say enough is enough. So we no longer accept the fact that we cannot have access. The demanding for water, for services, is a right for all people. So within the governments, there have to be deliberate programs to ensure access. There has to be targeted funding that is set aside, both publicly through government and also through the private sector. There is also need to actively involve the private sector in getting the solutions to the problems that we have.
The solutions also include training. If the continent is struggling to achieve the goal of sustainable access to water, this is partly because of the insufficient number of qualified personnel at effective institutions.
Vous savez, l'eau et l'assainissement, comme beaucoup d'autres choses,
As you know, water and sanitation, like many other things, depend on the quality of the infrastructure implemented and the quality with which they are operated, and this can only be achieved through quality and well-trained human resources. So, capacity building, the basic training of engineers, senior technicians, and the professional training of those who are already working, especially in management. These are key elements if we want to reach the forthcoming sustainable development objectives.
du développement durable à venir.
Tout le monde doit savoir quels sont les nouveaux défis.
Everybody needs to know the new challenges and the mechanisms we have to set up to overcome them, and this permanently calls for capacity building and even experience sharing so we can master what we are doing. Here in Africa, even if the technology comes from Europe or other continents, we have to take ownership of the intellectual dimension of it to give our water companies in Africa what they need to start afresh, because it is not all about skills transfer or applying the whole corpus from there. Let's come back home, let's master the technique and see how we can duplicate it so our water and sanitation companies can be up to par.
For participants, it is also urgent to better involve women in the water and sanitation sector. In Africa, they are still poorly represented, and it is on the basis of this observation that was held on the sidelines of the 18th Congress of the African Water Association, the first firm of African women professionals in water and sanitation companies. The point was to sensitize policymakers on the need to promote the presence of women in decision-making bodies of the water and sanitation companies of the continent and in the sector in general.
From time to time, we set up programs to address an issue, but it is important that these programs are monitored, and we also need mechanisms that can help monitor these actions for sustainable development, because any action not in line with sustainability is meaningless for me. So we have to make sure that access to water and drinkable water becomes sustainable, and this can only be done through sustainable development. Of course, all these activities should be in line with the country's global policy, so it is important to mainstream gender equity, to have institutional approaches that take into account all these gender dimensions in the water, sanitation, public health, climate change sectors, and all the sectors contributing to sustainable development. We have to organize so we can set up a robust and highly committed network so we can come up with solutions. Women have a special obligation in this respect. Well, this is what I expect of them. I'm doing it, and I feel like getting more involved. I think that if we can work together and strongly advocate for the presence of this theme in water companies, then we would have done giant steps forward.
In the coming years, Africa could improve its indicators of access to drinking water as recommended by the Sustainable Development Goals. According to UNDP, investments in the sector could rise from $800 million a year to $2.5 billion if service providers were taking adequate measures for limiting non-billed water on the continent and if local communities were mobilizing enough financial resources.